Could Gojo have done something like the 0.2 second domain expansion against Sukuna? Let's talk about it, but spoilers beware. All right, so this question comes to me from KingBot Matthew, and thank you so much for the support. And as you can see here, he's saying, could Gojo have made some sort of binding vow to activate the domain really quickly for like 0.1 second, just to make sure he hits Sukuna, stunning him, and then just, take him out from there instead of fighting head on? And I do think you bring up a good point here about like that really not being Gojo's style, but would it have been possible? So let's examine this. So first, let's look at this 0.2 second domain because that's going to be our best example of him doing something like this. And importantly here, this isn't Gojo adding any additional binding vows in order to make this domain quick. Instead, what's happening here is he's expanding the domain and retracting it in a time of 0.2 seconds. He's not actually activating it that quickly, if that makes sense. Now, I bring all of that up because what Gojo did in Shibuya wouldn't really be relevant to what he needed to do against Sukuna, because what matters here is speed of actually casting the domain, not the speed of the domain itself, if that makes sense. And we saw this in their fight, right? And not only were their domains equally refined, but they were also equal in their speed of casting them, which is why every single domain clash was equal and they had their little stalemate. That is until the one time that Gojo was able to get his domain off just slightly quicker due to the fact that he had injured Sukuna during the previous round. This is, of course, the moment that led to Vegetable Kuna. So I believe King's question is asking, could Gojo have made some sort of binding vow in order to cast his domain quicker earlier in the fight to just jump Sukuna with the brain dead infinite void and just win the fight from there? So this is a really interesting idea, and I do think it would be theoretically possible given what we know about this power system and how binding vows work. Now, I know it wasn't for a domain expansion specifically, but we do have an example in the series of a binding vow ridding the requirement of using your domain hand sign, which Sukuna did for the world cutting slash that he used to sneak attack Gojo. So theoretically, it seems as if you could make a binding vow where you could say, hey, for my next domain expansion, I don't have to make the hand sign and I don't have to make the chance. And if you don't have to do those two things, then your domain is going to cast slightly faster than it would otherwise, right? So Gojo theoretically could have made some sort of binding vow to not have to do those things and just cast the domain and sneak Sukuna with it. Now, I do think the price for that binding vow would be incredibly steep, but it does seem at least theoretically possible. But what I will say is, even if that was possible and Gojo had tried it, Sukuna might have still noticed the spark of that domain happening, and even if it was going to be so much faster, perhaps he could have reacted in time to do something similar himself, where he would have cast his with some sort of binding vows and we just would have ended up in the same stalemate anyway. So that could be one reason why it didn't happen. I just don't think this particularly ever entered Gege's mind, though, if we're going to be honest. And citing back to Gojo's character, like you mentioned in your comment, I think that's another reason why this didn't actually become part of the strategy. So that's my 2 cents, and this was a fun little thought experiment. So y'all let me know your thoughts down below. And then before you get out of here, I also wanted to shout out Lazy Weeb, who sent in some support and asked if I might play Madoka Magica. And I've heard of that IP, but I've never seen the anime or read the manga. But I'm always looking for fun games to play, especially to stream if I ever get the time to get some streams back again. But what I will say is that I have an enormous backlog of games that I need to play. So even if this was one that I was like, yeah, I got to try that out, it would probably be a while because my list is just daunting. But hopefully some Twitch streams returning soon.